topic this morning is African-American soldiers, and we're talking to Dean Bobby Lovett from Tennessee State University. And Dr. Lovett, before we had our first break, we were talking about African-Americans and the part that they had played in American history. Let's look at African-Americans during the American Revolutionary War. Give our audience as much information as you would care to give dealing with their situation during the period.
Well, as I said, the African-American was predominantly still in slavery when the Revolutionary War occurred in 1776. And about 10% were free persons, and that's the percentage that will be maintained until the Civil War occurs in 1861. About 10% of African-Americans were free persons, 90% were enslaved persons. They worked and lived in the 13 colonies. Virginia had the largest amount. In fact, more than 40% of Virginians were of African descent when the Revolutionary War occurred. By 1790, there will be approximately 750,000 persons of African descent living in the United States. That was our first decennial census. Making up, believe it or not, in that day and time, almost 25% of Americans. In the South, they make up almost 40% of the settlers in the South. So it was a significant percentage. And those percentages will hold until 100 years later in the 1890s, when a lot of European immigrants will come into the country, and the black American percentage will go down to about 12%, drop all the way to 10%. And then finally, in the last census, believe it or not, 100 years later, 1990, the African-American percentage is back up to about 12% or so in the country. But when the war occurred, of course, it occurred out of philosophy that individuals should be free of any coercion from anybody, including governments. And much of that thinking came out of the French Enlightenment, which had been going on, and philosophers from abroad in Europe. And so it was fought on the basis of liberty, equality, the fraternity of man. And you could not fight a war without bringing in the issue of human slavery in America. And so when the war took place, the British did invite persons of African descent to fight on their side, and they would free them, you know. And the Americans had to counter with George Washington finally giving in and also permitting free blacks to serve in the Continental Forces of the United States. All in all, about 5,000 persons of African descent fought in the Revolutionary War, about half on the British side and about half on the American side. The British did keep their promise, and when they lost the war and they surrendered in 1781, and they began to transport their soldiers back to England, they allowed those soldiers to return to England with them.
African soldiers.
Right, as well as their families. So there were more people who left with the British than fought with the British because they claimed they had been on the British side. We estimate about 25,000 persons of African descent left with the British. Some were taken to Nova Scotia. And in fact, in parts of West Africa where they eventually were resettled, they are still called the Nova Scotians. And the Nova Scotians are really the blacks who, or the descendants of blacks who left with the British. Most of the others were taken to Britain. They were settled in London and other towns and cities throughout England. In fact, just recently, I heard a commentator say, what happened to the African Americans who left with the British during the Revolutionary War? Where are they? They are in the blood of Englishmen. There was no real discrimination in that day and time like it is today in terms of separation of people. And so most of them have been absorbed into the
British population.
Into the blood of the British population. But 25,000 left. And we have ship records that shows the names of those particular persons who left. And so as many slaves as possible crowded on the ships. In fact, if you look at the treaty between the United States and Britain that ended the war, one of the conditions is that the British had to return the slaves who escaped. The British refused, but the British did say they would allow masters to come aboard the ships and identify any slaves that they could. But the ship captains made it very difficult, you know, for them to do that, and the British ships set sail, and so thousands of slaves left America and ended up in Britain, Nova Scotia, and Canada. And the British in 1787 established a colony for them, those who wanted to go. That country still exists. It is Sierra Leone on the northwest coast of Africa. Those particular persons who started that country were former slaves who had fought in the military forces of the British during the American Revolutionary War.
You know, Dr. Lovett, the revolution was successful and the United States was declared to be a free and independent nation. But let's look at one of the next most significant developments during this period, and that's the Constitution. What role did Africans play in the establishment of not only the country, but the writing of the Constitution? Not the writing, but in terms of their presence. What did the Constitution say in reference to that?
Well, once the 13 colonies won their independence, the problem was, could they exist as 13 separate countries? Or against foreign enemies, and they needed to come together and be unified. So we had a government. The Articles of Confederation was the first government, 1781, 1786. And that government was very weak because the states had most of the power and the federal government had very little power, could even tax, for example. And there was a counter-revolution, and that forced people to go to Philadelphia, the wealthy people of the country, to write a stronger constitution. And the counter-revolution was that the American Revolution was not a social revolution or economic revolution. It did not change the conditions or the ordinary man. Slavery was ended in some colonies, but not all colonies. So in 1787, the wealthiest families met in Philadelphia from May to September and wrote a constitution to protect property. It was not written to protect individuals. We did add a Bill of Rights several years later, 1790, to give some rights to citizens, but they had no rights in the original Constitution. When that Constitution was ratified in 1788, 1789, many people of African descent were free, and they voted for the ratification of that Constitution just like other voters did. So they did have participation in the approval of the Constitution in that time. One of the most important celebrations for African Americans in their culture is still July 4th. And many times we African Americans celebrate that on July 5th rather than on July 4th.
Dr. BLovett, we're coming up for our second commercial break, and after which we'll talk about some other aspects of the African American experience. And we'll be back with you following this commercial break.